Hello, Matt.
Hello, Mike.
Would you like to do the podcast?
Yes, but I don't want to do it in that voice.
Okay. Welcome to Hacking the Grepson. Yes, this is a podcast with Mike, and with me is Matt. We are software developers, and we want to talk about code today, but specifically updating your old, crusty, terrible, because it was written in the past code, for new, pristine, wonderful code that will never turn into that old, crusty code again, except for the inevitable passing of time in which it will. Yes, we're talking about refactoring, if you didn't get any of that. Specifically, I was thinking about refactoring code because I read an article recently where someone wrote, a person named Anton Zaides, perhaps, and it's titled, How Refactoring Almost Ruined My Marriage, and Why It Should Be Your Last Choice. I assure you that is not a clickbait title, except it is.
It's a little clickbaity, but he does actually explain it, so...
He does. Yeah. Just to quickly summarize this, he essentially had an experience where he was at his wife's parents' house for a few weeks, and he was looking around their yard and noticed that it was, in his words, a complete mess because there were piles of garbage, fallen leaves everywhere, abandoned, quote-unquote, tools in random places, quote-unquote random, old and rusty buckets getting in the way. And also, he remembered the mom always complaining about how messy it was. So he thought his idea to clean up everything by organizing the tools, collecting the leaves, throwing away the garbage, was a genius idea in his words. Unfortunately, it actually ended up backfiring because his wife ended up saying to him, "Honey, what did you do? My father wants to kill you." Probably not the result he was hoping for after doing such a nice thing by, quote-unquote, refactoring the yard. Because it turned out that his dad actually, or his father-in-law actually liked where stuff was.
Some of it.
And some of it, yeah. The things that he thought were, garbage were maybe not garbage to his father.
It was a compost pile.
Yeah, the leaky buckets were placed under strategic places where the gutters overflowed.
Right, so some of them had uses.
Yeah, the code, quote unquote, was not a mess to his dad, but it was to him, and so the refactoring was not a good idea. Right.
Well, but I'm going to counter that. The refactoring was a great idea. Doing it without asking about the existing system was wrong.
Okay,
you should always understand why things were done a certain way before you decide to replace them. That is one of my number one points in refactoring is understand what you're replacing. And they do actually touch on that in this article near the end. But to me, the anecdote he gives is cute, and I kind of get how it applies to refactoring. But the takeaway to me isn't don't refactor. It's right. Ask if you should. Hey, I have this idea. What do you think? We call that farming for dissent at my company.
Farming for dissent. Wow, that sounds heavy and official.
It's just hey, I have this idea. Anyone see a problem with it? No? Cool. I'm going to go do it.
Well, and also how this is not like code is that normally this refactoring would have gone through a code review process before being put into the code base. But he basically skipped the code review and went right to... He did it live. He programmed on the production server without asking anybody. That's what he did.
And there was no version control because you can't...
No version control. No going back. Yeah. So, like you said, cute anecdote. But so refactoring, let's get down to the foundation. What does it mean to refactor code, Matt?
Well, there's a couple of different definitions of it in this article even, or different uses of it. The one that I disagree with the mentality of, although I hold this mentality very strongly, is burn it all down and start over, right? What
That's
if
your motto, man.
It is, but I also know better than to do it. It's my instinct all the time, but I don't consider that refactoring. I consider that rewriting. Refactoring is where you take old code and you modify it in some way to become new code. Perhaps it's written in a different way, it's organized in a different way. The most recent refactoring I did took a library, a file that existed in one library and split it out into its own separate library. Like, that's refactoring. And then that thing grew and could do other stuff. That is refactoring in the most common usage, I think, is, hey, I have code and I refactored how the code is built or structured or whatever, and not I threw it all out and started over.
It isn't also, just to even flesh that out even more, isn't refactoring essentially changing code, like how it's structured or how it looks to a human, but without actually changing the functionality of how the code is when it's run?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think, it's not necessarily that it's 100% the code works in the same way. You might make, a change here or there. Usually you're refactoring for a reason. So often my refactoring efforts include that reason. But I would say good practice would be refactor to exactly the same state of functionality and then add your new things. I just know that I don't always adhere to that.
I'm trying to think, if we want to say that this article used a good analogy, it's not like he moved leaves, he moved tools, he moved buckets, but all of those things still were there and could be used or manipulated. They were just in a different form.
Yeah.
A different.
I mean, he did literally
flow.
throw things away.
That's true, he did.
But yeah, he didn't like dynamite the backyard and then build it up again. So I would say what he did to the backyard was refactoring.
Okay.
But some of the definitions used elsewhere in this same article fall under that more, like throw everything away and start over. Notably, he quotes an article, he even points out that it's 25 years old, by Joel Spolsky of Stack Overflow fame, among other things, but that's what most people know him for. That says programmers always want to throw away the code and start over. And I agree, they want to. I just don't think that that's refactoring.
Well, and also that they probably shouldn't, because of this nice adage. It's harder to read code than to write it. So basically what he means is, like, as soon as you have written code, to understand, like, if you walk away for a day and come back and look at it again, it's now going to be harder to understand it than while you were writing it. And so that's because if you assume that to be true, then a programmer is always going to want to refactor it into something that makes sense to them right then, because when they were writing it just then, it made the most sense. And so you're always trying to get back to that, like, epiphany moment of where you have just written the thing and you understand it 100%. But as soon as you walk away from it, that understanding starts going down, and you're always trying to get back to that state of, like, blissful euphoria of, like, oh yeah, I get what it's doing.
Yeah.
And so it's a hard thing to look away or to not do.
Well, writing code from scratch is fun,
Creation is fun.
Yeah, but on the subject of it's harder to read code than to write it, that's absolutely true. To me, that's one of the biggest reasons to refactor, is to make the code more easily understandable and more readable. I typically end up refactoring by encapsulating things. Like, I isolate them in their own little pocket. I make a class, or I make it a new library. I make a new service, whatever. And that isolation, that restructuring of the code so that it is more all of the logic that pertains to one type of object is self-contained within said object, i.e. object-oriented programming, makes it much easier to understand than when you have, like, maybe you have templated code that sits over in one part, and then you got a thing that's using that and inherited, and, like, it's so easy to lose track of what's going on. If you have something like, if you have non-destructive programming, right, you call a function and it gives you an answer as opposed to changing something underneath. That's usually pretty understandable. Most code is
Isn't
not
that
written
functional
that way.
programming,
That's
essentially?
that's what I said.
Okay,
I may
sorry.
not have used the actual term. I think
You
I just
said
said
non-destructive.
yeah.
So
Oh, that's right. Because I was trying to avoid saying functional.
why?
I don't know. But yeah,
Because we
functional
might start talking about
programming-
monads or something?
I don't know. Functional programming can be more readable from that perspective, but it can also be really hard to find code. Like if
Yeah.
you're trying to do the through line. Similarly, if you have object-oriented code that is not written, where the objects themselves are not defined correctly, right? Like if you pick the wrong abstraction, that's a good thing to refactor into the correct one. Like, because sometimes you'll write code, and as you're writing it, you will understand the requirements better, and you're like, oh, I shouldn't do it this way. But it's better, you don't want to stop and redo everything necessarily right then. So refactoring at a later date would be doing some of the things that you recognized in that moment as like, hey, I'm making this code less readable.
So I was going to say, like, when does refactoring become bike shedding or yak shaving or whatever your favorite thing is? Because I feel like refactoring is rarely a priority in a team, especially from a top-down management style. Like, management never sees that as more useful than, like, I don't know, adding a feature or fixing a bug, despite the fact that, like, you have humans that are looking at this, and largely the audience, the reason why you refactor generally, I think, is so that it's easier for you to read, for a human to read. So it's like they never prioritize the efficiency of the programmer, of the developer in navigating the code. Like, because that's not a user-facing thing. That's not a manager-facing thing. That's a developer-facing thing. So, like, is there a point at which refactoring is like is navel gazing and is not worth it? And
You may need to remind me of the specific question because I'm going to contradict you a little bit, which is
Okay.
I have been very fortunate to work at several places that did afford me the opportunity to refactor and did recognize it, and it did come from the top down. In fact, my last job, I was the one that typically advocated for such things to our executive committee, and they would often listen to me. Not always, but often they'd be like, oh, that makes sense. And that'll now circle into the answer to the question of like, when should we do this? If we always want to, when is the right time? So that you avoid all those many compound phrases that you just use that all basically mean the same thing.
yeah.
Which is everything in software engineering comes down to trade-offs. I think everything in problem solving in general comes down to trade-offs. I think life comes down to trade-offs. You really want to get accurate
Whoa.
about it. Dropping some deep
Let's just
knowledge here on Hack of the
Zoom
Grepson.
out, man.
Yeah. So when you're looking at refactoring in particular, the trade-off you're typically looking at is, am I wasting more time dealing with this code in its current state for whatever it is that I need to do, right? Adding a new feature, whatever. As soon as you start thinking about refactoring, the reason is because you recognize that if it was done in a different way, it would be faster for you to do whatever it is this thing that you're trying to do is, right? If that's understand the code, if that's add a feature, whatever. So a really, really obvious place when it does make sense to refactor is if the time to refactor and implement the new feature on top of that refactor is less than just doing the feature in the existing system, is a no-brainer. I don't think developers even need to ask really in that
Right.
situation. It's just like, I'm going to do this thing. The trickier one is when you frequently need to make changes to the same code and you recognize that if it was refactored, each of those individual things would go faster, but no one of them is worth the time to refactor the whole code. Does that make sense? That situation is where it becomes difficult for companies to make space to refactor. And again, I've been very fortunate in that respect of I've just had the position where I could advocate for it and get listened to somehow.
You got the Riz, man.
And the company I'm at now is actually like independent of me pushed down a mandate from the top of like, no, you should be spending time doing this because they recognize the importance of it. And in those situations where it is like, okay, I've got a bunch of different uses a bunch of different cases where I have had to waste time, it becomes a like, a probability game. It's like, okay, how likely am I to have to add new features to this code again? How many features? How long does it take on average? Okay, assuming this, is it worth spending this much time? And then, sometimes that comes down to just cost. Like, you bring it to the folks who worry about money at the company, whoever those happen to be. Sometimes that's everybody. Sometimes that's just like management.
Yeah.
And you can kind of present your case. All right, I'm spending an extra 30 minutes every time you ask me to do a new feature. There's probably a new feature every week. So I'm wasting, 2 hours a month. If I spent 8 hours doing this, it was only going to take me 5 minutes to implement new features. So for the cost of 4 months worth of my time on this specific thing, not 4 actual months, but like a day's worth of work, I can make it so this is always much faster.
Yeah.
And then usually if you have that, it's just a matter of, okay, we just need to schedule this where it was like, okay, we've promised these features, but we haven't promised this one on a time frame yet. So it makes sense to do it in between those two.
Yeah. And I think to bring this around to summing up this idea is I didn't want to skip where the old code is the best code. Did you want to say something about that? Because that seems like it's not a hot take, but it's definitely an opinion that maybe not everybody shares.
Yeah, I think, they have this graphic. It's like your old and battle tested code. And it's like this kitted out warrior with like scars, and he's got different medals and like a bunch of equipment versus refactored code. And it's like a shiny little anime RPG character with who's clearly never been in a battle. And, sure, you look at that and it's like, well, why would you ever refactor your code? But that is not refactoring. That is throwing it away and starting a new character, right? Refactoring would be like, hey, I've got this broken shield. I'm going to spend some time to repair my shield so that I have a higher defense, et cetera, right? And I think where it comes down to in this particular article, they're talking about robustness in some cases, and old code is typically more robust than brand new code. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be refactoring your old code. It just means you need to understand why that code is behaving the way it is and bringing that forward. If you have a good set of unit tests that fully test out your system, refactoring is fairly low risk. If you don't, it becomes high risk. With the exception of the people who think refactoring is throwing away your code and starting over, because that's just inaccurate.
Yeah. I mean, as with most things, that there's a spectrum, and it's like just, you're talking about refactor somewhere in the middle between not changing it and throwing it away. And some people just hear refactor and immediately go to the extreme of throwing it away. And I think the author of this sums it up nicely in the 2 things I advise you to do before starting a refactor, which is, 1, think about the future. Are there big features planned in that code base in the near future? If not, wait for them before you do anything. They might never come. So that's sort of like, yeah, is it worth it to spend all my time in this area if this is not something that's going to be touched? And then the other thing is make a true effort to understand the old code. Actually, I think that should be number 1.
I agree.
Because, like at my new job, basically most of my time is just spent understanding the code that exists and why it's written the way it is before I start thinking about changing it, let alone refactoring it, because it maybe isn't written the way I would have written it, but maybe there's a reason for it. And I think,
and if that's not documented in the code or somewhere, that is actually a sign that you should refactor, even if that refactoring is adding a bunch of comments explaining why. Right? Yeah. That's not even refactoring at that point. That's putting on a new coat of paint or something, to extend their analogy with the yard work. But it is a thing that is worth doing, because once you understand why something behaves that way, you can make intelligent, informed decisions. If you're just like, I don't like this code, I'm going to rewrite it all, and you don't understand
just
the why.
I wrote it.
Yeah. It's like, well, now I'll understand the why. And you didn't put in any of the same, like, you don't have any comments about why, and your code isn't obvious. you have just made the same mistake and worse because you've now gotten rid of any of the robustness of the previous system.
Right.
And that is a good point from this article.
Yeah, and I think that regardless of this article, the thing that I need to keep learning, because I have, as a solo dev, when I'm doing solo dev stuff, is that I'm not very OOP or even pseudo OOP, and I still like when I'm writing a thing because it's just for me and I'm writing it from scratch. I was going to say, actually, something that really helps with this thing, with this needing to refactor, is using something from the beginning that already has like a structure, like using Rails or using, something like that that has a structure of how your code should be. Because if not, you tend, like me, to write everything in like a file. And then you're like, oh, wait. No, this needs to be multiple files in folders so that things are isolated and so that you can more easily write tests for it because everything is in its own little spot. Yeah. But it's also harder to do refactoring as a solo dev because it's just me and I don't have other people to worry about or care. And so I can write spaghetti code, and as long as I understand it because I wrote it, then I'm okay.
Yeah.
But
it's harder to justify doing refactoring.
It's hard to justify it, but also like I may not have team members that are keeping me honest, but what I do have is old me and future me. And future me often is angry with old me because of the way they did things and they didn't refactor it properly. So now new me is like, ugh, I've got to refactor this.
Yeah. And I think that is a good point of like, it is more difficult to refactor than to rewrite a lot of the times because you have to keep things working in an existing system, right? If it's, I'm changing around where these files are, that might be a relatively simple thing. So that might be easier than writing new code from scratch. But in general, if you're like, okay, I'm going to isolate this stuff over in this area, but previously it was like super coupled in my code, like that is harder to do, like just objectively. But it's a safer approach than throwing everything out and starting over. So finding that balance, which is always key. Trade-offs and balances is such a huge part of all of software development. And again, life in general, that you got to do it.
There is no one answer to any of this kind of stuff. Anything worth doing is worth putting some effort into it to figure out whether you should and how much time you should spend doing it and whether it's worth it at all in the end.
If you're like me and you can't work on something because it's so like you have to like get yourself over some hurdle mentally to work on it because it's so poorly written, sometimes that's a good reason to refactor also.
Okay. So even sometimes just burn it down and start from scratch. Sometimes. Sure. Generally not, but sometimes. All right. Definitely not a statement about real life and living in our current world in 2024 at all. Only software.
Burn it down.
Okay. Well, I believe that wraps up our episode on refactoring. You should do it, but make sure you think about it before you do it. That's my final take. If you want to listen to more episodes where we talk about maybe factoring, maybe refactoring, maybe other things related to those things, you can go to hackingthegrepson.com. We try to put out episodes every other week on Wednesday. And until we talk at you next time, we now return you to your regularly scheduled lives already in progress.